get logged in here. We can do it. Am I on or was I on? No, I'm on. There we go. I can hear myself. The real question is, can you hear me? Okay, how about that? 2 for 2. I like it. Well, good morning. It's good to be back with y'all. We are launching into a new sermon series here at DUMC starting this week. And as a way to inaugurate that, Phil and Kathy decided to go to Ireland. And so they're still there. They come back this week, leading a trip. Excited to have them back. And I'll be preaching this week, which is fun. Give me another chance to share with you all. So what I'll tell you is what we're going to talk about today. You'll hear maybe an echo of it on Sunday, but it is a different, we're going in different directions here between the message on Sunday and what we're going to talk about this morning. So behind me, I asked our communications team to send me the logo for this new sermon series. And if you've been around our church for a minute, maybe a minute longer than I have, you know that every year at this time, we talk about being all in, right? And this year, the theme we're going to build on is being all in something beautiful for God. So here's the really cool news. Since this is the start of our stewardship series, what's the thing we're probably going to talk about at some point along the way? Any guesses? Money. Hey, so my next slide, Andy. Why give? So we're going to talk a little bit about money, and specifically, we're going to talk in this text about the context behind which Paul is writing. So we're going to spend a little time talking about money. But again, the theme is, when we think about giving, is a little broader than that. There are lots of ways in which we give. Sometimes in the church, you hear us talk about time, talent, and treasure. My experience is that you often don't have all three of those at the same time. You're in a season in your life maybe where you have more time to give, but you don't have as much treasure. Some of us have more treasure to give. We don't have as much time. And so the challenge for us is to think about this question, why give, maybe a little more deeply as we go through our scripture text for the day. So that's what we're going to do as we dive in together. And I'll try to be a little more helpful on the slides. So, and if you want to move us to the next one, let me give a little context. We're in the book of 2 Corinthians this week. Can you tell me anything remarkable about 2 Corinthians? That is exactly the answer I expected. So if I said 1 Corinthians, there's this chapter called chapter 13 that's about love, right? That you've heard at weddings or at other places. You have a sense of that. 2 Corinthians is another letter written by Paul to the church in Corinth. That's where we get the name Corinthians. And what he's doing here is trying to address situations that keep coming up. So think of it this way. It's as if you have, in Paul's case, started a church and then you've gone away. It's almost like sending a kid off to college, right? You've released them out into the world. And then at some point you get wind that things aren't going as you hoped. So you have a couple of decisions you get to make, right? Am I going to go physically visit them? Am I going to write them a letter? Am I going to just send them text messages? Am I going to stick their mother on them? There are a number of ways this scenario could play itself out, right? And so for Paul, he ends up writing a series of letters to the Corinthians. Now, what's interesting is that we don't have all of them. We only have a few of these letters. So it's believed, scholars have a pretty good indication, if you study the text closely, that there's a letter between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians that we just don't have. I think of it as a letter that probably, as best we can tell, scolds the Corinthians a bit. That Paul probably uses some pretty strong language to say, hey, you've fallen away from the things I taught you. And so Paul actually gets concerned about how did that message go, right? I sent my friend or my nephew to go talk to my son at college. And what I'm eager to hear is, how did that conversation go? Is he coming back in line, or is he going in a different direction? And so Paul actually goes to meet Titus, who's the person he sends somewhere along the way, to try to get a sense of, hey, how did they receive that, right? And in doing so, we kind of need a backstory to get to this story. So the story where we're going to pick this up is Paul writes them what is at least the third letter. It might even be the fourth. We're not entirely sure. But it's called 2 Corinthians because this is what we've got. Does that make sense? The first letter to the Corinthians, the second letter to the Corinthians, the one in between, lost to history along the way. So something is happening in that church in Corinth that Paul wants to address and that might have some lessons for us. And the thing he's going to get to, and we're going to get to today, is to talk a little bit about giving and why giving matters. So here's the thing when we think about context. Because something has gone wrong in the church in Corinth, or maybe they're moving in a different direction, as best we can tell, the thing that's probably happening is that Paul has taught the church, he's founded the church, he's helped establish the leaders, and now other folks in Paul's absence have come in and they are giving a different message. And so the challenge we have in our lives is, who do we follow, or even who do we listen to? And I don't know about you, but today folks talk about the attention economy, that the thing people want most is our attention. But this is what social media is, right? It's designed to hold our attention, or for the next screen up or the next video up to keep our attention grasped. And so this idea of who holds their attention is a question. Who are they listening to? Is it Paul, or is it somebody else who's come after Paul? And who will help them best walk in the way of Jesus? That's really the question at stake. And so for Paul, the first thing he's got to do here is right to kind of restore relationship, to get back into a place where he feels like he's connected to these folks in Corinth, especially because he hasn't been able to visit them. And then the place that we're going to land is he spends these 2 chapters, or part of what we're focused on today, encouraging them to take up a collection to send to Jerusalem. So 1 Corinthians in brief kind of has 3 sections. 2 Corinthians has 3 sections. The first 7 chapters are Paul trying to reestablish relationship. Because once you have relationship, it's much easier to ask for money. I don't know if you know anything about this, but this is the setup. Now, only a few of you know this, but my wife is a professional fundraiser, okay, at Georgia Tech, and has done this at a couple of institutions. So I have watched this work firsthand, okay? But it is about getting to know people, right? Building a connection with them and fundraising, figuring out what they care about and what motivates them. And then this is a phrase my wife has used for a long time. When I was in seminary, she worked as a fundraiser actually for the seminary I was at. And she said it was great training because the hardest group of people to get to give to a charitable cause are pastors. And her point was pastors don't make a lot of money. And when they tend to give to things happening in their local community, right? They tend to, because they see people in need, they're closer connected to situations like that. They tend to sort of give where they are. And so giving to a seminary or a college someplace far away, it's just, it pulls less on their heartstrings. But what Megan would always listen for as she was working as a fundraiser, she would say, it's about connecting generosity with need. Just because you want to give money doesn't mean it's something the school needs, but at the same time, just because the school needs it doesn't mean it's your passion, right? And so there's a relationship building phase that goes into this idea of asking people to give. We all want to invest in something that we think is worthwhile, and so that we'll pay it forward in one way or another. And that's the story Paul is trying to tell. So I'm going to give you 9 chapters in about 20 minutes. Sound good? You can read it at home if you'd really like to, but we'll get to the text in a minute. So let me back us up even farther to say, why is it that Paul wants to take up an offering? After all, he's not building a seminary or a football stadium or anything like that, right? An edifice that will stand beyond the test of time. He is instead raising money to give to fellow Christians in Jerusalem. So here's a little backstory on why that matters. You see, after Paul founds the church in Corinth, some questions arise in that early Christian movement about whether to be Christian, to be part of this believing group, these followers of Jesus, you have to be circumcised first. In essence, do you have to be, if you're a Gentile, you're not Jewish, do you have to become Jewish before they're going to let you into the party? Okay? So to be a true follower or disciple of Jesus, do you first have to become Jewish? Because those original followers of Jesus were, right? Jesus is Jewish. He calls folks around him who are Jewish. And so they share, in part, the ritual of circumcision beyond many other customs. And what's happened, we learn early in the book of Acts, is that the message of God has gone out beyond the Jewish people to the Gentiles, all of us. And this big question arises, do you have to be circumcised or not? Now, I don't know about you, but as you might imagine, if I'm a guy and Paul comes to me and says, hey, to join this Jesus movement, it'll change everything about your life. But oh, by the way, you have a little minor surgical procedure that needs to take place. Most of us are not thinking, this sounds like a great initiation ceremony. I mean, your fraternity had easier things to do, right? To join. Maybe not in your case. I don't know. So this is a big deal because if people have to be circumcised, the number of people jumping into the Jesus movement is probably going to be less. And so they've got to answer this question. What's required if you're going to enter into the Jesus movement, if you're going to be a follower of Christ? And so they have a conference in Jerusalem. Paul goes, he brings with him Barnabas, and he brings with him Titus, this other messenger, okay? They go to this conference in Jerusalem, and they meet with some names you might recognize. People like James and Peter and John. It's like the heavyweights of the church, right? So these are the guys who are sitting at the table getting to make the decisions. And Paul is walking in with Barnabas, and they've got to work this thing out. Now, as God would have it, they come to a really amicable solution. They are persuaded, as Paul tells them stories of what's happening in the lives of Gentile Christians, and they believe that the Spirit of God is working in them as it has in the Jewish people. And so, in essence, what they say is, we're good with this. Gentiles entering the Christian fold don't have to be circumcised, right? And in fact, we see what you're doing as an equal partner with us in the ministry that God has called us to. This idea of extending the gospel, of telling people the good news about Christ. And so here's how we're going to do this. We're going to do a really smart thing. We're going to divide and conquer. So John and Peter and James are going to focus their ministry on those who are already Jewish, who need to hear the good news of Jesus, okay? And you, Paul, Barnabas, Titus, we're going to send you out to minister to those Gentiles, those who aren't yet Jewish, right? But don't need to be. But they still need to hear the good news about Jesus and be invited into the fold, all right? So now we've got at least 6 people at work spreading the good news of Jesus. They've divided up kind of who's going to go where, all right? Seems like a pretty efficient strategy. Here's where the offering or the collection comes in, where giving shows up. What the 3 apostles, James, Peter, and John, ask of Paul, Barnabas, and Silas is that they would, as they do their ministry, as they go out to these new communities of Gentiles and spread the good news of Jesus, that they remember the Christians back in Jerusalem, that they remember those Jewish Christians who were first a part of the Jesus movement. And so a way to remember them is to take up an offering or a collection from those Gentile Christians and send it back to Jerusalem. Now, Paul uses a whole bunch of different language to talk about this offering. So you might say, what does he mean? At one point, he says, well, it's an opportunity to remember the poor. In another place, he talks about it as the ministry to which we're supposed to be a part of. He has these different metaphors, but the idea is the same, that we should raise some funds and send them back to support the church, and particularly those maybe who have less in Jerusalem. So the really good news from my perspective is this whole giving to the church thing, it like started at the beginning. It's not something Phil and I just made up, okay? So if you've been a part of church your whole life, you go, oh, that's where they got it. Okay, it is in Scripture, don't worry. Part of what they're connecting to is Paul's idea that there should be some reciprocity that exists in this early first century community. And here's what he means, that those who or Jewish who came to faith first have helped advance the Christian movement, have helped connect other people to Christ. And so as they've done that work, those who come after them are indebted to them because they've done the hard work of establishing this faith, of building a movement, of creating and sending out missionaries and apostles and other folks. So it's this idea that because they've already been at work doing these things, and it's because of their faithfulness that has allowed you to receive this good news, to have your life changed through Jesus Christ. We want to continue to support them and recognize the good work that they have done. To me, it's one of the things I love about a local church, and somebody who's new to DUMC, I see this acutely, that the only reason we're able to be here right now is because somebody came before us who had a vision for what could be, right? I mean, as I have studied the history here a little bit, the first church that is now Dunwoody United Methodist Church was right across the street in a one-room schoolhouse. And the first employee, we paid 25 cents to go start a fire on Sunday mornings in the coal box, right? So that the building would be warm enough for people to come. And so somebody had the faith to say, we're going to need a church in this community at then kind of the frontier in the late 1800s. And people since then have come and invested. And it's the reason we have this magnificent sanctuary, right? Or a modern service in the fellowship hall. And so a part of me wants to keep that going as a way to honor the commitment and the sacrifice that folks before me have made. But I don't just give as a way to say thank you to those who've come before me. I also give because I want to see this continue for my own kids and for kids yet to come. So it's a way of looking backwards, but I think also looking forward as we think about what our giving makes possible. So for Paul, in this community, this gift is something that would support those who have less, which is a part of Paul's thinking here. How do we who have more to give, how are we able to pay that forward, to pass that on? But also as a way to say thank you and to recognize that we're connected. Because here's the big shift that's coming. After this conference in Jerusalem, it's no longer Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, which is kind of how people thought of themselves up until that point in time. It's now, we're all part of this Jesus movement, right? We're all Christians. Paul has another line where he says, in Christ, there's neither, right, Gentile or Jew, slave or free, woman or man. His point is that our identity changes and Christ becomes the center as we go forward. And so this is a big shift in the early church, in the early movement. And this offering for him becomes a way of representing him. So I've given you a couple of factoids here. Before I keep moving, I'm going to click to the next slide. Let me just pause for a second and ask this question. So in light of everything I've said, what are some of the reasons that we might give, or that you hear Paul imploring people to think about giving? I'm going to get two of you to say something. So you can decide who that's going to be now. Okay, obedience would be a great answer. That's great. That's great.
Pay it forward.
Pay it forward. Okay. Obedience, legacy. This is pretty good for 727. Yeah. Respect. Okay. What else? Appreciation. So these were all things Paul is appealing to in the first 7 chapters of this letter. That makes sense. And so as we think about that, I want us to turn our attention then to the text that we're going to focus on for this Sunday, which is the beginning of chapter 8. So this is the moment where your alumni association has sent you the magazine, right? It's got all the glossy pictures. It tells some heartwarming stories. You're feeling really connected. And now the letter arrives in the envelope, right? That is the actual appeal to give. Chapter 8 is the letter coming in the envelope, all right? To connect one idea to the other. So Andy, you want to click over to that first slide? I'm going to read through it once, and then we'll come back to it. And I'm going to ask you to be listening for what stands out to you. This is the Message. So it's a paraphrase of Scripture. Eugene Peterson, who did this work, tried to help put the text in our modern language in the hopes that we might hear it a little differently. So I want you to listen for maybe something that jumps out to you as I share this text, because for me, there's some phrases in here that I'm like, hadn't thought of it quite like that. So this is the fundraising letter you've just received, okay? It goes like this. Now, friends, I want to report on the surprising and generous ways in which God is working in the churches in the Macedonia province. Fierce troubles came down on the people of those churches, pushing them to the limit. The trial exposed their true colors. They were incredibly happy, though desperately poor. The pressure triggered something totally unexpected, an outpouring of pure and generous gifts. I was there and I saw it for myself. They gave offerings of whatever they could, far more than they could afford, pleading for the privilege of helping out in the relief of poor Christians. This was totally spontaneous, entirely their own idea, and caught us completely off guard. What explains it was that they had first given themselves unreservedly to God and to us. The other giving simply flowed out of the purposes of God working in their lives. That's what prompted us to ask Titus to bring the relief offering to your attention, so that what was so well begun could be finished up. You do so well in so many things. You trust God. You're articulate. You're insightful. You're passionate. You love us. Now do your best in this too. I think it's a pretty compelling letter. Uh-huh. So what jumped out to you? Andy, you want to go back to the first part of this? Maybe let's start there. Maybe what phrase stuck out to you? Or what did you hear that maybe you thought, I hadn't considered that before? Bud, you going to jump in?
I'd be curious what was the biggest trouble? Was it a Roman or was there something in there?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know that we get it directly. Does that make sense in terms of what this is exactly what it is? Now, Macedonia is a region adjacent to, I think of it like Roswell, okay, to where we are here in Corinth, in a different region. And we don't know for sure that the Corinthians gave in the first part of the offering. But what we do know is that when Paul originally went to them, they were very eager to give. And after these challenges that church had, and again, we don't totally know what they are because we're missing that in-between letter, okay? Their enthusiasm to give is less. And so part of what Paul is writing to do is to see if he can't shore up that enthusiasm. And so he does something that you and I probably have done before in our own lives. He says, I want to remind you or inspire you with the example of somebody else who's done a beautiful thing, right? This church, the churches here in Macedonia. The churches, if you're thinking of the churches as letters that Paul wrote, are the Thessalonians and the Philippians. Those are the two churches in Macedonia that he's referring to, okay? But anyway, we don't know exactly what the trials are. Good question. What else sticks out to you? What's that? Leading for the privilege of helping out. Yeah.
Their troubles came down, trying to close their true colors. I almost expected it to be something bad after that. You know? Like,
yeah.
And so they turned against God.
Yeah. Yeah.
We were reading it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that strikes me about this too, is that this is as much for the Corinthians as it is for those in Macedonia.
Yes.
It is to give them something positive to do.
Yeah.
It is to give them the opportunity to be the church at work. And something that unifies them. One of the things that's going on in Corinth is that they're not very happy with each other all the time.
Yeah.
And so let's put aside our differences. Let's put aside, any disgruntling issues that we have with each other and do something for others as a way to be the church.
Yeah. To land that in a modern way, we've spent, I would imagine in North Carolina right now, they're spending a lot less time talking about who they're voting for and a whole lot more time talking about how we can help each other. Because there is a sense in which a bigger mission or purpose brings people together, always has. And so I think I would affirm everything David has said. The church has a lot of fighting within, and this may be a way to move it in a direction forward. Giving has that effect on us, I think. What else jumps out to you?
Their empathy for people in their situation.
Their empathy for people in their situation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I don't know. Have any of you ever been on an international mission trip? I know a few of you have. Just by my experience of having been overseas is that the people we are often with have far less than we do materially, right? And yet they seem to have so much more than we do spiritually. Isn't that interesting? And it reminds me of this passage that their trial exposed their true colors. One of the places I've been before is Haiti, which is a total mess, if you've read the headlines at all recently. But they were incredibly happy, though desperately poor. And I think there's something about when you have less, you're freer, perhaps, to give because you're not encumbered by all the things. I don't have to worry about insurance on because I don't own the thing, whatever that is. Just picking a practical example here. But there's this sense in which their poverty maybe revealed that which was true to them, a deeper spirituality, a deeper faith, and that they believed that God was with them in the midst of their trials, and could still use them even in that place to bless other people. And so sometimes, if you've ever had a friend who's gone through a significant loss, or I've had friends who've gone through a divorce or something, the thing they'll talk about is, I went and worked at the food pantry this weekend with my kids, and that did more for me than I ever realized it would. Because there's something about giving that helps reorient us. It's building on what David just shared along the way. And so there's this power that happens when we give that we don't even, I think, fully understand of how God uses that and then uses us to bless others. Okay, let's go to the second slide again, just to stop here for a second. So here, the thing I will say is that Paul has found himself in a little bit of a pickle, because what's happened is the churches in Macedonia are so eager to give. And at one point, Paul lifted up the church in Corinth as an example to inspire the Macedonians and to help encourage their generosity. And now what's happened? The church in Corinth is in disarray, and the church in Macedonia has grown and flourished. And so they're ready to give and excited to do so, and the folks in Corinth aren't. And so what was once the example or the teacher has now become the student, and the student has now become the teacher. And so I think we sometimes underestimate our role as examples for others when we think about giving. We're going to get to that in our questions in just a minute. But the giving and the things that come out of it isn't something that I think is just innate to us, but it is a habit we learn. It's something we can grow in. And as we grow in it, it changes this foundation that we have. I've heard it said, talking about college basketball specifically, but that people in a championship game, players don't rise to the occasion. They sink to the level of their preparation. That the pressure of an NCAA championship game doesn't bring out the best in most of us, maybe a few really exceptional athletes. But for most of a team, they sink to the level of their preparedness, right? And so I wonder if in giving, there's something similar here, that when we face trials, we don't rise to the occasion so much as we fall back on what's already there. And I think the examples that we experience, the stories that we hear, become for us a foundation that can help move us in a different direction. And giving might be a way to do that. So I'm going to stop here. And if you want to click over it, there you go. He's ahead of me now. So this idea of giving, it's complicated. It has a lot of layers to it. But I think in this story, what I keep coming away with is why give? And that giving does something beyond us. It shifts our attention and our direction. It helps us recognize that we're connected and unified with people in a way that go beyond ourselves. And it may be a habit that forms in us something deeper, right? That later in life or in moments of trial, it belays a spiritual depth that we might not get in any other way. So here's what I'd love for us to do. We've got about 20 minutes. Let me see if there are any questions, and then we'll move to table discussion. Questions?
Yeah, chronologically, what's the timing of this? What's the timing of the meeting between Paul and Jerusalem Council?
So we read about the Jerusalem Council in Galatians chapter 2. And David, you could help me here. So Corinthians is written after that. This letter to the Corinthians is written after that. I don't know the exact number of years in between.
I was thinking.
Yeah.
So chronologically, if you
Mm-hmm.
take it back, resurrection about what time it happened.
Yeah. What would you say?
I would guesstimate, not too long.
Yeah.
It's within 10 years.
Okay.
Of the death of Christ.
Yeah. Because this is happening rather quickly. I mean, Acts kind of walks us out, the coming of the Holy Spirit, and then Paul's call to ministry. And then he begins to go out right after that. Go ahead, David. Are you going to share any more?
Basically, that's where he gets his marching orders.
Mm-hmm.
He gets vetted
Mm-hmm.
by the Jerusalem Council to be an official evangelist,
Mm-hmm.
not someone that's on their own, but someone under the umbrella of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that is interesting of this is that Eric's already mentioned that there's an intentionality about who's reaching out to who.
Yep.
And so from Paul, we get the Orthodox Church created. And out of Peter, we have the Catholic Church, as we understand it, know it today, coming out of this. So, pursuing the Jews and then pursuing the Gentiles. And yet they are in ministry to each other.
There you go. Andy is fact checking us, David. He says somewhere between 15 and 20 years. Only the ones he feels comfortable telling them they're wrong. Go ahead. Man, David would have a better sense of that than me. I think the physical distances between these communities, between Thessalonica, Philippi, and Corinth.
If you look,
I didn't bring a map, but yeah.
Greece, the very northern tip of the country of Greece currently is where Kavala is, a port city, and just north of that is Philippi. If you will go about 40 miles south of there, you get to Thessaloniki. You got to go all the way down to Athens and out to the Isthmus, which is where Corinth is. And so it's a pretty good distance. I mean, it's not next door.
Yeah. And
so we're asking basically one community to do almost international mission.
You would say, yeah.
They're going the whole country of Greece, basically, from the Isthmus all the way up to Philippi.
So Titus and Paul are making that journey. And in this letter, Paul's hoping to come back through Corinth again. But they're in the same region. Is that kind of making sense to you in what is now today Greece? But I knew I couldn't do better than David, who's literally led so many trips to this part of the world. Yeah.
Yes. If you leave with us on Easter night next year, we're going to Corinth, and we're going to Philippi, and we're going to Thessaloniki, and we'll be in all those places.
See? I just want to be clear that we did not plan this in advance, okay? This is just the spirit at work.
Nothing like being there.
And it's true. I have been to Israel, but I've not been to these places. It sounds beautiful. All right, other questions? Go ahead.
Four guys can do it, you ought to be able to do it, is what I'm reading.
I do have a sense that Corinth is a more prosperous community. And so part of that is its location, as David was describing, out on this isthmus. It's a port city, and it's also more cosmopolitan than some of the other places in that way. But again,
It was larger than Athens.
yes, yeah. But I think one of the challenges of that, as I talked about a little bit earlier, is because of its location and its prosperousness, it's also then a place that other people are passing through with other ideas. And so part of what happens in the church in Corinth is they're wrestling with, is Paul the one we should follow? Is it other people who have come to the church? Are they people who have a different message that we should follow? And so part of Paul's reestablishing relationship is to try to keep them on the, he would say, the right track, and not to be led astray by others who might wander through. It's interesting in this story, we never get like an amount of money they're trying to raise. Does that make sense? As much as to say, we're asking you to do your part to finish, is one of the phrases our scripture text uses, right? This work that others have begun for this collection that would be then sent back along the way. Okay. I'm going to move us to table conversation, and then we'll come back and wrap up. But here are a couple of questions that I thought might help us think a little bit about giving and take this story and drive it home. I want you to think about some of the most generous people that you know, and maybe what do they have in common? A second question might be, whose example shaped your giving? And this could be giving of financial resources. It could be giving of time. It could be giving of gifts that you have, skills. And then what were your best investments and what were some of your worst? I'm not thinking of this as stock advice, okay? More as, where have you invested yourself that you've seen a return? And where are places maybe you invested yourself that you haven't? And then the last question I thought just would be funny or fun. Maybe what's the last thing you gave away? I can tell you the last thing I gave away, I took my daughter with me to Goodwill thinking I was doing a good thing by setting an example of giving some things away, only to discover that the beat up cooler that I was passing on to somebody else, I had not asked her permission to release that item to someone else. And so she promptly told me after I'd handed it off that, Daddy, I love to play with that. And why did you give it away? And I thought, because we don't need another beat up cooler in my house. So even in giving, I didn't involve her maybe in the way that I could have in that process. So there's some learning for me. So let's take about 10 minutes at our tables. Let's talk through these questions, and then we'll come back and wrap up.